Thanks, everyone, for joining us, the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield. I'm very glad right now to be joined by Nicola Griffith, who's the author of 9 novels, including Hild, Spear, and Meanwood. In addition to her fiction and nonfiction, she is known for her data-driven 2015 work on bias in the literary ecosystem, and as founder and co-host with Alice Wong of Crip Lit. Awards include the LA Times Book Prize, Society of Authors ADCI Literary Prize, 2 Washington State Book Awards, the Premio Italia, Nebula, World Fantasy, and Otherwise Awards, and 6 Lambda Literary Awards. She holds a PhD from Anglia Ruskin University, is married to writer Kelly Eskridge, and lives in Seattle, where in 2024 she was inducted into the SFF Hall of Fame. And in 2025, she was named as SFWA's 41st Damon Knight Memorial Grand Master. Nicola, thank you so much for joining us.
It is my pleasure.
And we're here predominantly to discuss your most recent publication with PM Press, She Is Here. But of course, it encapsulates and brings together works that exist elsewhere. And so I wanted to start with kind of a broader question that doesn't just have to do with this specifically, but that kind of is a red thread through your work. And that's women through time. And I myself have done quite a bit of research about so-called Viking women, and the so-called Vikings didn't write their own histories down in ways that we have access to. Things are either written about them by contemporary outsiders like Ibn Fadlan, or Christians a couple of centuries later with all the anti-pagan and anti-woman trappings that go with that. And here we are looking back, and though we can recognize the failures of, say, a Snorri and his looking back, we're incapable of removing ourselves from our perspective and looking back. We can't place ourselves in the time and place of Hild, for instance, partially because we can never fully forgo subjectivity, but also because, as you note, there's precious little to go on. It's not like researching Napoleon, a man with, that lived more than 1,000 years later. So there's something that feels a little ghost-like, that we will only ever have specters of these women, and the forms of them are very much our own making, as much as we try to create this mosaic of who they were. And at the same time, we mirror something, some kind of female experience through time. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit to this work of looking into history to create that depth in the present, and also to find solace in not knowing, and how that might echo into other spaces.
Let me start at the end. I actually don't really find solace in not knowing, except in the sense that it gives me a lot of freedom to maneuver with story. Anyway, thinking about story, thinking about history and what we can and can't know, so many of us, let me speak for myself. I grew up thinking of history as fact, as what actually happened, as being wholly true, like solid and immutable. It's what happened. But history is just a story we tell ourselves to make sense of what we know, or what we think we know of the past, based on the evidence of old documents and bones and ruins. And what makes sense to us, to each of us, really depends on our own understanding of the world, our experience and beliefs and cultural biases. The story depends on the storyteller, is all I'm trying to say. And I write about early medieval Britain, and the main source for that, the only real source for that, is Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. So just listening to the title, you can hear the prejudice built into that. It's an ecclesiastical history, and it's of the English people. I mean, Bede was a monk, and so he brings with him the whole Pauline misogyny of the patristic writers of the time. And I'm talking now, Bede was writing in the early 8th century. He's the closest we have to a contemporary source for Hild, but he was writing 50 years after Hild's death. I doubt they ever met. If they ever did, it would have been the year he became an oblate, as in he was 7, and it would have been the last year of Hild's life. So basically, no, they never met. And that's the real reason that I don't rely on documentary sources at all. I rely on material culture. I rely on archaeology. And the reason I do that is because of the way I write. I write from the body. I write about how people respond to their worlds. There's nothing I like better than to put a person in a place and see how they react. It's like I constantly run these. Think of them as experiments. You build a little terrarium, right, of the trees and the woods and the rivers, and then you put a little person inside and see what they do, see what happens. And the advantage of that way of writing is that bodies are bodies, people are people. People have been essentially the same. Our sensory apparatus has been the same for thousands and thousands of years. How I respond to the world today through my skin, through my sense of smell, through sight, sound, is exactly the same way someone would have responded 1400 years ago when I'm talking about Hild. So if I throw away the documentary sources and think about what bodies do and how our minds work, then I find that I can know quite a lot. I can imagine someone like me. Okay, so I'm queer, I'm pretty smart. I exist in the world now. The world doesn't always like the way I present myself in it, but I manage, I find ways around things. And so I have zero doubt that people like me existed back then and that dealt pretty well with the world. And so when I write about the past, I put people of color in the past. I put disabled people. I put queer people. I put a lot of people from the underclasses, not just the rich people. And they're not just there for comic relief, they're real people. Because I know we exist today, and so of course we existed in the past. And if you think about it, really, it doesn't matter if we're talking queer people, disabled people, people of color, women, men, whatever. Anyone beyond living memory is ghost-like. I mean, even someone like Shakespeare, I mean, he lived 400 years ago. He spoke the same language we do. We have his plays, we have his will, we even have an image of him. But when it comes right down to it, what do we know? We know nothing. So for me, it's not so much about depth in the presence, as it's about populating the past with women, queer folk, disabled people, people of color, and seeing us not just being able to be there, not being permitted to survive, but actually belonging, going way beyond surviving, but actually thriving, and even sometimes being the heroes. Because if we can read a story where in the past we can be the heroes, then it gives us a different sense of ourselves today. And if we have a different sense of ourselves today, then I think it bodes pretty well for tomorrow. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that also does a lot to combat this idea that, you know, particularly from this Eurocentric or US centric perspective, that things have just been getting better and more progressive and more egalitarian throughout time. I mean, there were a lot of non-white people in the so-called Dark Ages or the so-called Middle Ages in Europe, predominantly because the caliphate was much stronger than Europe at that time, and the idea that the racism that we experience today can somehow be laminated onto that period of time is completely ridiculous. And so I think that also what you're talking about also does a lot to combat this idea that, oh, we're at this pinnacle of egalitarianism, and if you have a problem with it, it's because you're not going out and achieving, or you're not picking yourself up by your bootstraps, because imagine how much worse it was for women back then, right? Like,
I really, really hate that Calvinistic rubbish. The American exceptionalism, manifest destiny. I mean, it drives me up the wall. No, I mean, we all stand on each other's shoulders. Nobody can do it on their own. We all do it as a group. But I want to go back to that bit that you said about the caliphate. I mean, I write about Northwest Europe in the early Middle Ages. And so, of course, yes, I don't really talk about Arabic culture because it's not part of my story. But I want to point out that the Roman Empire was a hugely multicultural empire. There were many actual African people in Britain in Hill's time. I mean, the abbot of Canterbury, Hadrian, was an African man. So it, people have this notion of this lily white Britain, and it just wasn't like that at all. It never has been.
Yeah, well, it's so much more convenient to whitewash things, isn't it?
To literally
Um,
whitewash, yeah.
and I wanna dig into a little bit of the the kind of the ghost-like world as well, our relationship to magic and to spirituality. And this is a theme that comes up quite a bit in your work as well, like Hild, of course, but also examples in the book, your most recent book, Cold Wind, and Many Things in Dumnit, and women in particular being the keepers and conduits for this kind of power, even embodiments of this power, a power that today is often ridiculed or capitalized upon in a sort of like snake oil kind of way, but also very legitimately held, passed on, interrogated, struggled with, uplifted. So I'm curious, what is it that brings you to this facet of womanhood and the importance of it in these times of rather unacceptable realities?
Um, I suppose, let me say first, I'm very, very wary of thinking of women in essentialist terms. I'm always a little nervous about talking about women and spirituality and women and women's magic. But I think if you want to think about it, I think of women less as magical creatures, as keepers of knowledge, practical, hard won, empirical knowledge. Certainly in the early Middle Ages, of, say, healing herbs, food, textile productions, all those things that keep people alive. Um, so, okay, if I allow myself one sweeping generalization, and I really hate binaries of all kinds. I prefer to think of spectrums of behavior. But okay, if you say there are women here and men here, and please imagine when I say women, I mean people who identify as women, whether we're talking trans women, cis women, queer women, non binary, intersex, etc. Then in this Western industrialized culture, women have a long association with the domestic sphere, which is almost always about the needs of the body, the household, food, medicine, that keeping the fire burning, literally, staying warm, staying alert to danger close at hand. And these are sensory skills, and they involve observation, putting two and two together, and forming a picture of the world and testing that empirically over and over and developing a particular expertise. And one of the things about expertise is that decisions made from expertise can appear to an outsider to be almost magical, because these connections that happen in the expert brain happen faster than words. They might look like magic, but it's not. It's hard won experience. And the reason I'm saying all this is that actually the short fiction in She Is Here, and of course my short novel Spear, that's the only fiction I've ever written with magic in it. Most of my characters, so take for example Hild, she achieves her apparent miracles through a combination of smarts and opportunity and observation. And then in my crime fiction, Aud does amazing things because she's simply willing to use violence as a tool when most people don't expect women to do that. So, because of women's hard-won experience and knowledge of human behavior, and women, of course, have spent a lot of time having to understand the world more acutely than some men have, because women have been more like prey animals than predators. And generally speaking, prey animals know a lot more about their predators than predators know about their prey animals. So women have learnt to really really interpret signals in the world. And in to continue with this sweeping generalization, we can be sometimes more hard-headed, more practical, more realistic about, for example, bread and butter economic issues or environmental issues, or because historically it's women who have to pick up the pieces and try put them back together again after a tornado or after a war. So we pay attention.
Absolutely. And I mean, what you said reminded me of something I heard from a self-identifying witch in New Orleans, of course. She said, magic is just something you don't understand yet. So,
Well, that's
um,
like the Arthur C. Clarke's saying that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
yeah, there you have it. Um, and I want to get into something that is, to the silenced and the forcibly unseen. You talk about quite a bit the remarkable dearth of disability in fiction, and this is something that you've researched quite a bit. And you point out that when we do see it, it's often portrayed as something that makes the character problematic in some way, or it's just a problem that needs solving. And you also, again, you write about this in She Is Here. And I'm wondering if you could dig into not just the quantity of disabled stories, but also the nuance, the relatable real life complexities that are missing. And what this does, as Bertolt Brecht noted, art is not a mirror held up to the world, but a hammer with which to shape it. What does this do to the world in shaping it when such voices are missing?
Well, this really goes back to part of my answer to the first question, which is that the stories we tell depend on who's telling them. Because I think it's stories, whether we're talking written or spoken, that create culture. We don't just mirror culture, we create culture. We're cultural creators. Culture is this shared story of who we are, and the best stories are empathy connectors. That they show us and teach us about each other, and as we absorb these stories of each other, we unconsciously absorb the values and biases embedded in them. So non-disabled cultural producers, the writers, the filmmakers, they tend to produce art that reproduces their non-disabled view of the world, which is steeped in ableism. And before I go any further, I want to say every single one of us is steeped in ableism from birth, because we literally don't see disabled people. Let me tell you a true story. Back when I still walked with crutches, I use a wheelchair now all the time, actually outside the house. Back when I still walked with crutches, I went to a bookstore, went up the steps with difficulty on my crutches, and went to the counter and said, "So, you need to get a ramp. Disabled people in wheelchairs can't come in." And the woman behind the counter said, straight faced, "Well, why would we need a ramp? Because people with wheelchairs just never come into the shop. And I was just, it's like, well, no, of course we don't, because we can't get in. And that's the thing, people don't see disabled people in real life. They only read about them in stories, and these stories are produced by non-disabled people. And so we are literally not visible in the world. We're not visible in clubs and pubs because A, we can't get in, and B, we can't even get to the venue to try and get in because there are no wheelchair accessible Ubers and lifts. I mean, they may say there are, there's perhaps two in Los Angeles, but trying to get one makes them functionally not there. So we're not seen, we're only seen in stories. And so when a writer, there's a couple of there's one particular famous book and film, Me Before You, that it epitomizes what non-disabled people do to disabled characters. They create these disabled characters in a way that they imagine they would feel if they were disabled. They think, they see someone in a wheelchair and they think, I'd rather be dead than in a wheelchair. There would be no point in life. The wheelchair is terrible. It'd be the end of my world. And so they put that feeling on these characters. And so you get a story like Me Before You, in which this good-looking, smart, wealthy, decent human being in a wheelchair who falls in love with a non-disabled woman decides to kill himself at the end because, hey, she'll have a more normal life if he's not in the way. And this is the kind of rubbish that disabled people see about themselves and that non-disabled people read and believe to be true. Basically, non-disabled cultural producers treat disabled characters as narrative prostheses, by which I mean we exist in fiction only to serve the needs of non-disabled characters. We exist as a lesson for non-disabled people, or as inspiration for non-disabled people, or as occasionally evil people. Disability as a signifier of evil is another trope that I particularly dislike. So what's missing when real disabled characters are missing from fiction? Real people are missing. 25% of the population of Earth is missing because 25% of the population of Earth has a significant disability, and we are not portrayed as real people.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, with that, it goes, the breadth of disabilities, like the idea that, when somebody says, think of a disability, a lot of people think a wheelchair. And it's like, but a lot of disabled people don't use a wheelchair because that's not their specific disability. And to really get into why that is the specific thing we think of. And it's also very reminiscent of, if you look back at how Black folks were portrayed or Indigenous folks were portrayed, being savages or being evil or somehow defective. Like that also very much tracks with how disabled people are often portrayed in stories as well.
Yeah, I think disabled people are the last great permissible prejudice. I mean, there are so many people in the world who really don't understand that it's not okay to think about disabled people this way. They have no problem with saying, calling people retards, or saying people are deaf and dumb, or using lame as a derogatory term, and so on. They have no idea because it's not even ableism, and the prejudice against disability isn't even in the world enough for people to understand that they shouldn't say these things in polite company.
Yeah, and should certainly interrogate it if they're thinking about it in private as well. um, and I want to wrap up here with a question that is, you know, it feels very, unfortunately, very timely. But I guess there's
Mm.
probably not a time in history when it wasn't timely. The story in your book, Down the Path of the Sun, which is a post-apocalyptic read that is the kind of apocalypse that too many women have lived through, and not lived through. And I wanted to touch on this because the men in the story are not present in the sense that they show up physically. It's almost like a violent storm that comes through. You don't see it directly, but you always see the destruction that's caused by them. They're not even named as men, they're just gangs, but everybody knows, right? It's like the patriarchy. You don't really always see it embodied, but you always see the effects of it. And it's not just a specific man, but an architecture, a system, like a gang. And it felt like a dystopian view of dystopia. Like even on the other side of whatever this mess is that we're living, we're still burdened by the worst of our societies. We can't shake this storm. And the afterworld is still somehow made in the image of the world that came before. That even when women live together away from men, we are not away enough from the structures that mete out that violence. So this essay is clearly about grief, but it's a grief that isn't natural, right? It's the kind of grief that comes from the violent breaking and ripping of autonomy, of youth, of violations that is not of like our natural cycles of life and death that we just have to accept. And I know that you wrote this back in 1990, which is also depressing that we're still having this conversation, perhaps even more so today. And I'm wondering how you feel about this piece now. A bit like asking Orwell if he would have lived to see 1984. How do you feel about that?
Well, speaking of 1984, that was the year I actually wrote the story. This was the very first short story I wrote because I wanted to write a short story as opposed to it being a school project or whatever. It wasn't published until 1990, but it was my very first short story as an adult. And I want to go back and look at what you said earlier. It's really interesting to me that you assume that the gangs are men. I'm actually very careful in the story, and it is a short story, not an essay. I'm very careful to never draw that equivalency. I imagine them more as bands of people, some of whom, yes, are men, but perhaps not. I don't know. I never tried to imagine them too closely. But they are bands of people who have. This is a post apocalyptic world, and the world is coming to an end. It really is. It's not like all these people will survive and gradually start reproducing again and growing. The world is coming to an end. And I imagine these unseen bands as the people who have given in to despair. And they have basically lost their humanity to that despair. So there's nothing left inside them but howling chaos, but destruction, because they can't live and they don't want anyone else to live. And I really didn't write it as a theme story. It's a very personal story to me about a very personal grief. It's the story of the dream in the story is an actual dream that I had as a teenager over and over and over again about my little sister dying before her time. Now, let me back up a little bit and say that I'm one of 5 sisters, and 3 of us are queer, and we're from a deeply Catholic family. 3 of 5 of us were queer. And my 2 queer sisters are both now dead, and they both died young. My 2 straight sisters are happy and healthy and living a great life. The world killed my queer sisters for being queer, basically. They drove them to a kind of despair because they couldn't find a way out. And I think certainly one of my sisters hated herself for being queer. She didn't want to be queer. Me, I always loved myself. I always loved being queer, and I think that's why the world didn't quite get around to killing me. It had a really good try, a very good try occasionally, but I'm still here. I'm still happy, living a good life. But yeah, no, the story is very personal. It's about a very real grief for the world and what it does to people. So in that sense, yes, it's very timely. It's very, I worry about people pre-obeying, pre-giving up, pre-complying. You just look at some educational institutions who immediately rolled over on their DEI initiatives when the administration came to power because they didn't want to lose their grants. Instead of every single educational institution in the country banding together and saying with one voice, no, we are not doing that. It's a classic example of divide and conquer. I wrote an essay about this called How to Defeat an Autocrat. And it's basically about the strength in flocking behavior, the strength in communal action. So, how do I feel about the story today? I think it's still sadly very, very true. I wish it were not. And I am more hopeful than that story is. I mean, that story, the world was coming to an end. In the real world, no, it's not. People worry that it might be, but no. Wow, our job is to tell the stories where we survive, where we thrive, where we find a way to fight back or to steer, should I say, to steer what's going on into a more fruitful and productive channel. I think it's important to not lose hope. And by hope, I don't mean happy, clappy optimism. I mean being unwilling to give up, being clear that survival depends on continuing to hope and believe that we can do something and to keep trying.
A jagged hope, not a passive one.
Yes.
Yeah, and it is interesting because when you were talking about my assumption, it reminded me that I'm going to butcher it because I can't. I'm so bad at remembering these things. But Ursula K. Le Guin she said something about how when you read a book, you are participating in its creation as it is participating in the creation of you as you read it.
Mm.
And yeah, of course, when we partake in a book or a short story like that where something isn't explicit, we of course pour part of ourself into it. And not of course, but my my pouring of that was, oh well, it's got to be men, because that kind of violence to me just said, oh, this just, like, it felt very visceral in reading it. And yeah, and it's always interesting to hear the creator's take on it, and that, you're speaking about that kind of absolute despairing chaos. So
Mhm.
there we have it. Folks, please do check out, I mean, well, all of the books. I read Hild years ago and still love it. And the latest book is by PM Press. She is here. Folks, do check that out. Nicola, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.